last but not least, we invite Professor Dr. Tukufu Zuberi to take the stage. Zuberi is a Lasry Family Professor of Race Relations and Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He is dedicated to bringing topics of race, African and African diaspora populations to the public using various platforms, such as guest lectures at universities, television programs, and interactive social media. He curated several exhibitions and created films about the major museums in the United States for the hit series, the PBS hit series, History Detectives. Remarkably, this series is in its 11th season. His latest exhibition was a redesign of the Penn Museum Africa Gallery, which bears the title Africa Galleries from Maker to Museum. Professor Zuberi's publications include a wide range of articles, monographs, and exhibition catalogs, such as Africa Independence, How Africa Shapes the World, which came out in 2015, and Maker to Museum, which is forthcoming. Professor Zuberi, as a scholar and demographer, you focus much of your attention on the artificially, purely ideologically based construction of race. In your television series, you passionately connect privately held objects to larger historical trajectories, thereby creating meaning for and enhancing the life of the object's owners. The Benin objects clearly have a very large story, and we look forward to hearing how you might enhance and open additional avenues of thought for us. Please take the stage.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of the colleagues and everybody here at the Humboldt Forum. This is my second visit, if you will, and it is continuing to be a very welcoming place for me, and so I do really appreciate that. When I came last time, the Benin exhibit wasn't even open. I think the doors were closed and they were refabricating everything. And at the time, the director and I talked, and he said, well, we're going to make sure we invite you back. And I don't know if that had anything with me ending up here today or not, but I'm glad to be here with you. And I want to thank my fellow panelists for their very engaging conversations. And at those points where we disagree, I want to just tell them it's all in the name of pure academic efforts to take us to that next place. My first slide in the background of it is the background of what I'd like to talk to you about. This is the entrance to the exhibit that we curated at the University of Pennsylvania. The facade here is a metal construction of all of the orishas. The artist is a Brazilian artist named Jorge dos Anjos. And Jorge is known for these humongous, very large sculptures, and often they interweave his notions about ancestry, about Africa, about being part of the African diaspora, and being part of that conversation. And that's a very important starting point for me, because what he presented this as is a way of introduction, a way of peaceful entrance into a space which for the most part has been very hostile to Africa, very hostile to African diasporas, very hostile to all of these communities, and he's offering a way of reconsidering the entire process. I mean, in some ways, I think I'm a person who has done a number of curatorial projects, and I'm still doing curatorial projects. I have another one that's coming up next year, and others in my head, in case anybody wants to listen and come and see them. But the idea of me at a museum, the idea of me, I've been teaching at the University of Pennsylvania for going on 4 decades and a couple of years. So I've been doing that a long time. But the idea of me at a university, though, I find these institutions to be very much Eurocentric spaces of exclusion. This is what their history has been. And this is the big battle that they are engaged in order to become relevant to human progress and human future. So in some ways, I am very much captured by Aimé Césaire's words that he wrote so many years ago, that all things considered, he argued, it would have been better not to have needed them, in reference to museums, that Europe would have done better to tolerate the non-European civilizations at its side, leaving them alive, dynamic, and prosperous, whole and not mutilated. In this way, this is an important consideration, and I ask you to keep that in mind as we go along. There was this very interesting project that the French engaged in, and they engaged in this process of thinking about what restitution would mean by asking a couple of scholars. They asked a European woman and an African man to write what they thought about restitution. And I always thought when they wrote that book, why didn't they invite a brother? I mean, I would have been up in there doing some things and telling them some different thing. And the reason that they should have invited me, yes, Europe is important for this conversation. Yes, Africa is important for this conversation. But you do your mind a great disservice if you do not recognize the importance of the role of the African diaspora. I understand. These are the people who were enslaved out of Africa, and they were enslaved much like this material culture. But whenever I see people talking so much about restitution and don't have space to talk about the African diaspora, I find it an odd imbalance, a very odd imbalance indeed, something that must be fixed, okay? And in every chance I get, I say this, because the obvious is often the thing we would avoid. Academics, we know this well. We simply don't cite the person. We simply act like they didn't write what they wrote to continue a tradition of deception. So I don't like continuing traditions of deception. I like to do some other things. And I want to walk you through the thinking I had behind this redesign and re-curation of the Africa galleries at the University of Pennsylvania. And then I want to show you, give you a very clear example of how we did it, and to kind of raise the question about that. Now, I have talked a lot about decolonization, and I don't think you can decolonize a museum. I think you can decolonize the narratives in museums. You can decolonize how we discuss what is going on and how we discuss the collections in museums, but I don't think you can decolonize it. And if you think you're decolonizing it, you're neo-colonizing it in a way. You're bringing a new form of the same thing without considering that in a re-articulation of it, you must also establish different relationships. Now, don't get me wrong. The same could be said about many modern institutions. I said my university, and I love the university. I've been there more of my life than I've been anywhere, but it's a Eurocentric institution. Museums are a Eurocentric institution, but they're very, very important. You can't throw it away. Too many people are visiting. It is creating an international conversation. You have to intervene. You don't kill the patient, you try to save the patient. And in this case, the patient is the museum, and the idea is how we save it and make it even more relevant today. So our task is how we transform this situation. So take my comments in that vein, if you will. first, let me clarify something, which is always whenever you talk about Africa, whether you know it or not, whenever you talk about the enslaved Africans, whether you know it or not, you're talking about race. So let me clearly define race. Race has nothing to do with genetics. It's a beautiful thing about the Human Genome Project. I remember one meeting they had with the president of the US, the president of Britain, the person who founded one genetic corporation, and the person who founded another genetic corporation. And they all came together and they said, well, one thing we know, there is no genomic difference among human beings. I know people are testing themselves to see what genetic thing they are, but that ain't got nothing to do with their racial identity. I think I just got the mystery thing up there. Okay. Furthermore, to take that even a little deeper, but just so you're on the same plane with me, race is not a system of color. Everybody knows if you get a nice, very white woman and put them with a nice, very black man, they are not going to produce a gray baby. Okay? And that's a reality of how we have been taught and groomed to think illogically about the tint of our skin. Some people even think it's about melanin. But if you don't have melanin in your skin, you really can't tolerate the sun. You're not going to be getting a tan or anything else. It is something that will modify your behavior when you go outside. So race is not about color. Race is about one thing, in my mind. Race is, what am I doing? What happened? Okay. You don't want me to continue here? It's, okay. Oh, there it is. Race is socially constructed to facilitate inequality. That's all race has done. It has not improved anybody's situation. And the truth be told, it hasn't improved the situation of white people either. Okay. They're not white to me. They're classified as white. And that is real. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying race is not real. It is fundamentally real because of its social implications. And that's why spaces where we have public conversation are the places where we can address the difficulties of these issues. This is where those conversations should take place. They should take place up in here. We should be talking about what does it mean to be civilized? Who came up with the word of a barbarian? Who came up with this notion of fetish? And what does it mean to us today? Even as we take it out of our narratives, we still need to understand what it means because it is part of the public discourse, part of the public discussion. Now, here is what I want to suggest to you, and you can check it out. Go read all the books you want. Race before the 1500s, before the modern epic, did not exist. Definitely people considered how people looked, the colors of them. Ibn Khaldun is famous for recording this and discussing it all over his travels. So that's not the point. But this kind of system, this ideology of race where you create structures of colonialism, structures of enslavement that are based and articulated and justified in the name of race, that is new. And that is the problem that we are confronted with. Now, here, this is just a schematic diagram to show you the importance of this European diaspora which went around the world to colonize. And not only did they colonize, they also went around the world enslaving. And these processes had big transformative impacts on humanity and who we think we are today. Now, sometimes people talk about this thing called the Columbian exchange, and it's supposed to be a relationship between Europe and the rest of the world and the kinds of things that they exchanged. And in this kind of thinking, it is felt that the museum in the West developed in response to the needs of an imperial and colonial mentality. That is, you needed to understand those you were going to colonize. You needed to understand the extent of what your task was. If your colonization meant embracing those people and transforming who you were, that would have been another project. If your colonization meant extraction, whether of people or of things, that is another thing. So this mentality needs to justify the racial divisions of the world without reference to the processes that produced the differences. You might go around thinking that, there's something like development and underdevelopment or undevelopment. We now understand, I hope we do, that surrendering of the populations in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, and some of the islands, was an offering to the deity of modern capitalism. And museums in the West pay tribute to justifying this slaughter in the past and the present when we do not transform these narratives and establish different relationships between those and among those that had their very existence transformed by the creation of this colonial process. So the first modern museums in the West began to take shape as the Colombian devastation consolidated into a new order. That's what you had in Germany with your first museum around 1857. That's what we had with the creation of the British Museum. That's what we had with the creation of the Museum of Man. That's what we had with the University of Pennsylvania, where I am the curator of the African collection. In this new order, the world became differentiated between the free and enslaved, the colonized and the colonizers, the civilized and the barbarian. Not that everything is a dichotomy and there is a lot of levels in between, but it is the extremities of these processes which trampled upon the lives of millions of people over hundreds of years. If we don't recognize that, forget about going anywhere else. We cannot develop the empathy we need for each other in our future if we cannot recognize the harm that we have done to each other in our past. Museums advance national narratives of identity and class. This is why the people who are in our museums have an understanding, a deep understanding of the society that they are in. And sometimes this extends beyond their borders. Chamberlain was at a meeting towards the turn of the century in which he was meeting with many other leaders. And he looked over at the American representative and he said, "We have more black people in our nation than you do." And he laughed and everybody else laughed. And he said, the fact is very clear and everybody knows it because we have more people colonized in Africa than you have in the United States. The French have more space colonized in Africa than you have in the United States. So if you really want to understand the dynamics of the racism that was behind colonialism and the racism which extended into these enslaved populations, therein it lies by that mentality where you can joke about the oppression in the 20th century. The inclusion of the enslaved and colonized in these spaces served as justification of colonialism, enslavement, neocolonialism, and racial marginalization. I want to play a small clip from you. When I first started this project at the University of Pennsylvania, Julian Siggers was the director at the Penn Museum. He is now he's the president, they don't call him the director there, he's the president and CEO of the Field Museum in Chicago, or the Film Museum is not there, but in Chicago, which is another one of these large ethnographic historical museums bent on telling the story of all of us. This is what he had to say. The museum advertised itself.
It is dedicated to the recreation of history, that is, to rebuilding the story of man's slow rise from the most primitive states to the heights of the great civilizations.
How has the museum grown beyond that? And what are the potentials for where it can go?
Well, I think all museums evolve. And as you say, they start off from royal collections or Wunderkammer,
But then public museums really come out of the Enlightenment, which actually had fairly noble intentions. However, museums are always products of their time. And there were museums like this one that used the word like primitive. But we've evolved way beyond that. And so a good example would be how we display our Native American collections here. So we would never have an exhibition here with Native American material that wasn't a real and meaningful collaboration with Native American people who these objects originally came from. So for the Native American Gallery, there were over 80 Native American groups that are involved with the production of that gallery. And I think that really is the way of the future, is actually more of a collaborative format.
However, like the British Museum, the French Louvre, and the Humboldt Forum, Penn Museum seeks to be encyclopedic. The 21st century demands a reckoning with the colonial practices of the past by Western museums in their efforts to achieve this objective of universal representation.
The
Now, I
museum
must say
advertised.
that clip comes from a documentary that I did called Decolonizing the Narrative. It got stuck in its production process during the pandemic, and I'm still trying to get it out of there, and I'll get it out. But it's Decolonizing the Narrative. The first modern museums in the West tended to ignore the emancipatory and decolonizing projects of redefining what it means to be a human, in particular with reference to Africa's relationship with Europe, and more recently, the United States. During these formative years, the Penn Museum Africa Gallery were curated in ignorance or denial. I give them the option not to be ignorant and simply say that they were in denial, depending on which one they want to go with, of the social movements of Pan-Africanism in the Anglophone colonies, Negritude in the Francophone colonies, and Pan-Arabism in the Maghreb and North African colonies, for transforming the world, specifically Africa's relationship to the world. Now, I mentioned these movements because often we forget that Africans could not have gone to these universities to write these books, to be a curator in a museum. Y'all understand that? They couldn't have done that in those numbers, in those days. So the people who did do it kind of marked the founding base of the institution. And here's a conversation I had with the director of the Museum of Black Civilization in Senegal.
These concerns in a Pan-African context, I visited the director of the Museum of Black Civilization.
Après, il y a eu le grand festival mondial des arts nègres de Dakar en 1966. Et suite à ce festival, il a été décidé de créer le musée des civilisations noires. Pour rappel, pendant ce festival, 2 personnalités ont été distinguées pour avoir influé sur la pensée noire, c'était Du Bois et Cheikh Anta. Donc c'est à la suite de cela qu'on a décidé de créer ce musée. Vraiment, la vision de ce musée, la première chose, c'est un musée de rupture. Parce que généralement, dans les musées, vous venez, on vous montre quelques objets, on vous dit que c'est ça l'Afrique. C'est ça l'art africain. Nous, on dit qu'on n'est pas d'accord. L'art africain, c'est la création de l'humanité. Donc, c'est de montrer que l'humanité, ça commence en Afrique.
In the West, there's a big discussion about decolonizing the museum. What way does this museum play a role in this conversation?
C'est un débat, il nous intéresse, mais nous refusons d'être les prisonniers de ce débat-là. Les Européens, ils ont pillé l'Afrique, ils ont volé les collections, ils doivent les rendre. Et je pense que le président Macron a vraiment eu une idée de génie en disant qu'il faut rendre à l'Afrique ce qu'on lui a pris. Restituer, c'est rendre à son propriétaire légitime ce qui a été volé. Donc, on est totalement décolonisé dans la tête. Et je pense que le débat sur la décolonisation des musées et des collections en Europe, c'est un faux débat. Ils ne pourront pas décoloniser les musées. Les musées qui ont été faits comme étant des conséquences de l'action coloniale, comment on peut les décoloniser? C'est dans leur ADN. On ne peut pas les décoloniser. Nous, on a rencontré l'Europe, il y a eu l'esclavage, il y a eu la colonisation, on est toujours debout. Non, mais non seulement nous sommes debout, mais nous avançons maintenant. On va passer au-dessus.
I visited these concerns in a
Understanding the impact of the hegemony of Western museums and the principles of collecting and displaying Africa is fundamentally important. The relevance of the curators, the artists' understanding of their surroundings and culture is important. Challenging the white logic of the Western epistemological point of departure and its attendant aesthetic paradigm is fundamentally important. I've suggested to you that to be white is an idea. It's an idea whose time has long passed. We need to embrace a way of thinking which allows us to return to our human origins. And that is going to take a lot of critique of what we think we know. Now, we get to this point because the museums have grown as institutions, but they have grown as Eurocentric institutions. We get to this point because universities have grown, but they have grown as Eurocentric institutions. This is why, from many directions, these institutions are under attack, sometimes by those who are not even at the institutions, not even in the profession of being a professor, because even they can see that the very fact that these institutions were race-based has tainted the intellectual content of what is taught at universities. So even when you think of debates, that's why I say the first people who raised the debate about decolonization were Africans and the African diaspora in their Pan-African movement, in their Negritude movement, in their Harlem Renaissance, in their other movements all over Latin America and all over the world. And so there needs to be a reconsideration of that. It's just when they came to fight, you first need independence to take this struggle to the next level. You first need to have social rights in order to take this thing to another level. And we are approaching those levels. But as we approach them, it is for us, once we are here, to reconsider how we got here, to reconsider what it means to just go in the tradition of those who came before us and how we transform those traditions to be more inclusive. So can we change the Western Museum, the idea of the Western Museum, the practice of the Western Museum, whether it is in Europe, the United States, Latin America, or Africa? Can it be changed? Do we possess the language and appropriate terminology for grasping the aesthetic vision of the items presented in the galleries of the West? And if we do understand it, can we communicate it? Do we have those linguistic facilities? Do we have that cultural sensibility? Do we have those spiritual endowments in order to take that conversation someplace that is beyond the fetish that they got labeled as they entered this space? Can we produce the paradigm shifts necessary for the cultural fluency for understanding and interpreting Africa in a non-marginalized way? Because it is not simply giving some items back to Africa. Of course, that needs to be done, let's be clear. But that is not the only issue that is before us. It is not simply rearranging objects. Of course, that needs to be done. It is not only reconceptualizing how we use space, sound, sense, and all of these visual aspects to contribute to what we know about the places, but we actually need to change how we think about the places. And that's not easy because the world has not sped up with these ideas. We do not live in a world where there is economic equality, where the trade agreements are agreeing with these shifts, where the economic relationships which exist in those countries are there. And if you don't change those things and you think you're going to change these things, it's not going to be that successful. So these processes of educating and providing public education, which the museum does, need to lead a charge for how we change our thinking in order to begin the process of a decolonization of the world, which is an institutional change. It is not enough to simply say, and it is not enough to simply change a word. You have to change material conditions and relationships. Can African artifacts, items, be properly understood within the current theoretical constructions of modern museology? This is where many of the questions grow, right? Because it's not simply a question of elevating African art to the level of European art or taking European conceptualizations of art and finding out which pieces of African art kind of match these pieces of art. It's not simply a question of doing these things if the objective is not a remembrance and a suggestion for something that's going to be new. So we were engaged in the redesign of this space at the University of Pennsylvania for the Africa collection and the curation of the Penn Museum's Africa galleries. Now we said, this is what we offered, and I first offered this in around 1999. I suggested to them that I would like to take and engage in a process which transformed the galleries into a new thing and spoke a different way about African material culture. And the curators and people in the Africa collection kind of giggled. So then I started talking to the directors of the museum, and they were resistant until I found Julian, who was open to the idea, and the time was right. Because the foundational works that constitute the Penn Museum Africa galleries were collected prior to the end of World War II. They were collected at a time in which the world was thought to be divided into the colonizers and the colonized, and in which the formerly enslaved were all in a point of trying to find freedom in these spaces. That's what was going on there. So it wasn't just an intellectual enterprise that was going on. Something needed to now justify this new terrain. So for us, we said, okay, we will ask 5 questions, a couple of them which had been suggested by other scholars. And here's one quote that I'd like to take a moment to read to you. Thus, in order to decode these objects, an ambitious and it's talking about the objects in the museum, and an ambitious and at the same time completely ridiculous task. Okay, you got to understand the ridiculousness of it refers back to Amy Césaire's quote. If only we think about this, if we didn't have imperialism, you wouldn't be talking about this. If you didn't have racial marginalization, you wouldn't be talking about this. It's not that Africa just found out it had culture. Africa invented culture for humanity. Everybody started in Africa. There's a monogenetic origin of humanity, and it's Africa. Okay, let's not forget that. So it's not like somebody was bringing something to Africa. The cradle of human civilization is in Africa. So it's a completely ridiculous task, but it's because of our ridiculous circumstances. Let us say that one could refer to at least 3 minimal criteria. His criteria were we needed to raise the question about who made it. We needed to know how and why they made it that way. We needed to know what its meaning was or is, and what it is for. Okay, that sounds like more than 3 questions, but he presented them at 3. Okay, I'm still going too. And to these, I wanted to suggest that we add the issue of provenance. not the little provenance, that this was made in Benin. But how did it get from Benin to the Penn Museum? And what is it doing in the Penn Museum? Why do we still have it in the Penn Museum? And what would their reason be for showing it to you? Why are they showing this to you? You remember the advertisement for the Penn Museum in the 40s was that we trace the journey from the primitive to the civilized. Y'all know who was down there with the primitive. And you know who was up there with the civilized. You don't even have to act like you don't know, okay? So there you go. If that becomes part of the provenance, that is how we even talk about these objects, what they mean, then we begin to engage in a different conversation. So as in my journey of doing this, I have traveled all over Africa, all over Europe, all over Latin America, all over the United States, and I have talked to curators. I was here speaking to the curators and directors of museums about their process, and I was here doing that as well. I have a witness, he's here. And in this process, I learned a lot. I want to start with this as a kind of overview of our interaction with the Benin objects in our gallery. And so we went to Nigeria and we had conversations with people at the National Museum of Lagos, in Badagry, in Benin, and different places. And our idea was to try to learn what we needed to do. And I asked them, I told them, that's our lot of stuff, they took it off and put it in, they hid it. So far, you gotta go deep in the archive to find it. And they took it down. And I said, but to me, something's sour about that. And that even if we begin a process of restitution, can somebody think about my granddaughter? Can somebody think about her ancestors who were enslaved and sold away? Can somebody tell me and talk to me about that? And we can talk about objects as being ancestral and having their space, but objects are connected to people. Nobody's talking about an object that is not connected to the people who created. In Africa, we have this big problem that so many millions were taken, and they're part of this ancestral line, and scattered around the world. So it's more of a complex situation to have this conversation about restitution. Of course, some of the issues are clear, but as I said, this one is not. And who sits at that table and how they engage in that conversation needs to be seriously considered. It's not a laughing matter. It becomes a laughing matter when we don't appreciate the historical significance of how we got here. Okay, he's not going to talk about all that, but he is going to talk about Benin.
At the National Museum, Benin City, I visited Dr. Theophilus Umogbai.
What purpose does this museum serve?
Historically, the objects, like I said, tell our story. Tell our story of evolution, the cultural evolution, how we evolved as a people. They tell our story of the dexterity and the intelligence of our people. The producers of these objects were orally literate. So they were orally literate in the sense that they could communicate in Benin language. That makes them intelligent. So they helped us to tell our story about our history. And of course, you know that the history of the monarchy is tied to the history of the people. Because right from the start, the Benin recognized the fact that they needed leadership. They didn't want one foisted on them. And none happened. Not even during the period that the Oba was taken to Calabar.
The British punitive expedition resulted in the exile of the Oba of Benin and the looting of the royal palace. Many of these objects found their way into the Penn Museum. I visit the Penn Museum's archives for evidence of this tragic provenance.
The archives are full of valuable information. Look at these letters here. These are from the brother of one of the surgeons attached to the British punitive expedition in Benin, 1898, just a year after the British punitive expedition. And here he is talking, communicating with Mercer about purchasing some of the items from the British punitive expedition in Benin. And you can see here this particular item, one ivory armlet, is one of the key items in our new galleries. Beautiful. Gets you a sense of, one, the majesty of the items, but two, the process by which they found their way into the museum.
Let me try to make that point. I'll try to make that point even a little more fundamental. Here is the shrine which we've been talking about today from 1891. This particular image and kind of the transformation of the pen collection. It just received a large number of Benin objects, and here is the curator looking at those objects. So you see the transformation of the space is not a replication of what their use was. This, to me, is problematic. Now, here is that same image to what we tried to do in a different space. So what we tried to do was change the narrative about the objects. That is, we tried to change the objects. In some ways, we changed the physical space. So we have an altar of her own, which is about the Queen Mother's altar, and it's as was described earlier. And another, just over to the right side here, you see we're trying to replicate the Oba's altar. Now, we couldn't put the tusk back in the scope. They told us that wasn't curatorially possible, and it would go against all rules of conservation. I argued and argued and argued, but they were right and I was wrong, so we put them in there like that so that people could check them out. But our idea was, rather than just showing them in a grouped way, was talk about how the items from a sacred altar were taken from that place. And furthermore, to offer evidence. If anybody wanted to know where these items came from, we offered evidence of where they came from. In the background here, what you see is, on the left-hand side, what you see are texts of a letter written by a former Surgeon General. The guy I was just talking to you about, his letter I found in the archive. And he's offering to, he's there. He is there. Okay, the guy is there in Benin, and he asked his brother, who has connections to the Pen Museum, to write to the Pen Museum. And his brother writes to the Pen Museum, and he says, "We have all of these items for you, and one is that bracelet." So our introduction to the Oba's palace is a discussion of how these items were stolen. And now we do talk about the meaning. We talk about the beauty. We talk about, how some of the items were ceremonial, but how those ceremonies were depicted in the plaques. We provide narrative in that way, but at the same time, we say you cannot lose sight of how they got here. And that's an important thing, because even if you're just looking at their meaning, now this has become part of their meaning. Now this has become a sense of what they mean to us and what they mean to others. And I have the curator of the Theodore Monod African Art Museum in Dakar, Senegal. And he's a curator at an art museum. So everybody so far I've been talking to have been curators at African historical museums or ethnographical museums. And, these museums which offer, as the Humboldt Forum originally would have been offering, a universal interpretation of humanity, touching on all edges of it. And here is what he has to say about this effort. That is, can we fix You know, so here I am trying to do some repair by thinking I can engage in a transformation of the narrative and that this is beginning a process. And he adds what I think is a very beautiful layer to this process.
What do you think the impact of a museum like this should have on museums in other parts of the world that are trying to show Africa as well? What should be the relationship?
Bonne question. Moi, je pense que nous tenons à, nous avons intérêt à travailler ensemble, à avoir des partenariats, à collaborer. Mais cette collaboration doit ne plus être une collaboration de façade. Parce que la collaboration que nous avons eue avec les musées américains, européens jusque-là, c'était des collaborations où les musées américains ou les musées européens ont besoin de quelques objets pour faire une grande méga exposition blockbuster aux États-Unis ou en Europe. Et donc, ils viennent nous emprunter des pièces. Donc, c'est une collaboration à sens unique. Or, ce à quoi nous devons travailler maintenant, c'est une collaboration équitable, c'est-à-dire comment monter des projets de recherche communs sur les collections, comment organiser des expositions communes, itinérantes, sur les collections, comment ensemble revisiter l'historiographie, revoir les objets pour leur donner de nouvelles charges. Comment faire des projets, par exemple, de recherche où il s'agira de chercher carrément les noms des artistes qui ont fait ces objets? Parce que c'est des projets qui se font de plus en plus. On a tendance à dire art Dogon, art Bambara, voilà. La collection en a hérité parce que les informations ont disparu, sont perdues. Comment aujourd'hui faire des projets dans ce sens? Moi, je pense que si nous devons collaborer ensemble, s'il y a des institutions qui doivent être dans ce débat global sur la question, par exemple, de la restitution, c'est faciliter les échanges d'idées et faciliter également le développement de nouvelles connaissances.
Perhaps we should start with pursuing Sylvia Winter's suggestion that a better understanding will follow a discussion of the relationship between the epistemology of knowledge and the liberation of people. That it's not just knowing a nice, good idea. It is about the relationship of that idea to people. You may have noticed that people are very central to my understanding of our way forward. It's because they get talked out of these discussions. And we need to rehumanize these objects. The curator in Senegal would go on to say, we need to re-energize these objects. Because while we may create makeshift altars for the Oba, we may create something for the Ioba, we may present how they do the music with instruments, that is only a beginning of a conversation. And so I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to invite you all to engage in that conversation by critically engaging with the material that you see in museums, that you curate in museums, and that you oversee in museums. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tukufu. That was a very engaging talk. I felt a little bit like I just revisited my African-American courses in the United States, and it was a really very nice sort of summary and reminder of some really, really important issues. I would like to invite the audience for questions, both here in the room and online. We do have a question online.
Okay, there is one, Ignacio Campino. Wo ist er jetzt? Can you please turn on your camera and your microphone? Ich sehe ihn jetzt nicht. Ah, there he is.
Perhaps we have a question in the room? Yes.
So can you hear me now?
I know, he's... Okay, please go ahead with your question.
You can hear me now.
Yes, we do.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Zuberi. You quoted Amy Césaire with the sentence, whole and not mutilated. And does it inspire me to my question? How much omissions are allowed in a museum dealing with difficult history?
I'm sorry, I didn't fully hear the question. Could you please repeat it?
Yes. My question is, how much omissions are allowed in a museum dealing with difficult histories?
Omissions.
Omissions.
Yes, you know, the interesting thing about museums, I love going into the archives of museums. And yesterday I spent the day in the Humboldt Forum Africa archives for this museum. So I was elated. Y'all don't know, I was walking through there, my chest was out, everything was good. I love going into the museums. And the one thing about the archives of the museums is that the archives show you that they don't contain all African history. You can't put all African history in one place. It just doesn't work. So museums are necessarily, by definition, selective. And the real question becomes, who selects what? That's why it becomes problematic if they have a colonial mentality towards Africa. That's going to condition what they select and how they tell the story about what they select. That's why I say one of the things that has to happen is a change of the narrative, because we have to change how we are talking about these objects, which is in part to recognize we don't tell the entire story. I mean, my colleague was talking earlier that we needed to infuse a more intersectional analysis in how we talk about what is in the museums and how we think and talk about Benin culture and Benin people. I mean, because look, I'm quite sure the people of Benin were talking about their history, were talking about their culture, long before anybody came along. They already knew about their relationship with the Oyo, with the Ife. They already knew about these relationships because they were living them. So the nuance of lived life is only captured in fragments in museums. It's what is collected and placed there. And that's why, you know, you look at some of the sculptures and they may be missing a piece here and there. That already tells you don't even know everything about that sculpture. And you will have to speculate. And if you don't understand the culture, that's why I say, if you don't understand the culture, you don't understand the history of it, you don't understand the spirituality of it, you don't understand you don't understand it, you don't understand. So you'll get caught in the speculation, and speculation will be driven by what you do understand. And those are your biases.
Ja, das stimmt. Richtig. Und was macht man dagegen? Das hast du jetzt ein bisschen vergessen, darüber zu reden. How you would address.
Thank you for thank you for the wonderful presentation. I have, of course, many questions. I will limit the number of questions. First, I was thinking about what you were writing about Pan-Africanism. You know, remember being one of the co-founder of the Pan-African Women's that was Liberation Organization. Now we are here, Pan-African Women's Empowerment and Liberation Organization. It's very interesting. And you were talking about Pan-Africanism in the English-speaking, I mean the Anglophone, then negritude in the Francophone, and then Pan-Arab movement in the North African and some other countries. But actually, how do you overcome this fragmentation? Because I mean, you have Francophone, Anglophone, and other phones, and Pan-African movement was encompassing the whole of the continent, plus the Caribbean, plus even Europe or even other continents. So how do you, in the museum practice, how do you overcome this fragmentation, especially along these Mafa lines, as a Mafa from Great Destruction? That would be the first question. Then the second question would be, do you also ask curators that are other than men, like women curators? And that would be the second question. Then we're talking about the history of resistance. And that is something that seems to be very difficult for museums to portray, especially because the majority of the information actually is still lying in the archives or hidden somewhere. So how do you manage to showcase, I mean, to really insist on the history of resistance? Because anybody who left the continent was an African first, and basically African people resisted. So how do you convey that? And the last little question.
Yeah, that's three. Let me do
this.
this.
Is a comment. The last one is a comment more.
Okay.
The way you were saying about, to talk about where exactly with the artist who where the people where the person who creates this entity. Then at the same time, when you have all these the people who are European and actually got influenced by our way of creating entities to make to paint. I'm talking about people who are very, very well known here. They should also, instead of saying that influenced by African art, they should say as well influenced by art coming from this region, may it be with this group of artists. That would be the last one.
There was and thank you very much for those questions. I thank you very much for considering my words seriously like that. Let me start with the first one. I mentioned those movements as distinct movements, although anybody involved in those movements would have, the Negritude movement was not ignoring and saying they're not involved in the Pan-African movement, because they were very much involved in it. The same with the Harlem Renaissance. And so there was that kind of interrelationship going on with them, yet that they were movements in themselves, defined in that way, and somehow containing themselves in that way. I'm just trying to give them that. But I would say that that is in itself a process that Africa is going through. That is, Africa has to resolve this question about African identity. Nigeria has to resolve what it means to be a Nigerian. And how does that relate to being Edo, relate to being Yoruba, relate to being Hausa, relate to being whoever else makes up that nation, as Nigeria needs to resolve how it relates to South Africa, how it relates to Senegal, how it relates to Libya and Egypt. In all of these interrelationships, these are major questions for Africa. So they are constantly being discussed and debated. No matter what you do with the Organization of African Union, you can change it to the African Union, and this is still going to be one of the principal conversations. And so it remains. And it remains a big question for African nations. So you see many African nations, for example, attempting to remove the borders and restricted travel, beginning to give out passports and visas to people in the African diaspora. So you do see these movements, these kind of changes, which didn't exist in the past, that are coming to fruition now. Where will that go? Will that end up being, will the AU and the African unity, will the AU be like the EU? Will there be a common currency? Will there be common military strategy, economic strategy, so forth, and so on? This stands as a question for Africa. It would be good if the African diaspora has a voice in it, because they probably have something they might be able to contribute. But this all has to come as a process of Africa and its own political maturity, and it needs to do that quickly. There was a guy who wrote a book in the 90s. He organized a traveling exhibit in the 90s called The Short Century, and it was about African independence, in which he marshaled a ton of information. The catalog is now well famous and well known in, what's his name? Oh, yeah, and so, yes, you can do that. And he was able to do that in a way that was representative of the artwork that was done, the films that were being made, the posters that were being made for the films, and engaged in all kinds of conversations, and engaged with people like Amy Césaire on this kind of question, and many of the other important intellectuals of that day who had in some way had a relationship with the foundational ideas about African independence and changing the space that we exist in. His ideas about museums continue to mature, as you could see in the Biennale that he organized and in several of the other exhibits that he did. So I'm not saying that by me, I am learning from these traditions. And I'm just trying to suggest to you that part of what I'm learning from is understanding what people were trying to achieve in these liberation movements. These liberation movements were a positive thing. They transformed what we consider to be a human being. They did that in fact, and scholars are continuing to catch up, and museum curators are continuing to catch up. I know you might think that one should be ahead of the other, but it's actually the other way around. Was that all three of them? Oh, women curators. Yes, thank you very much. I was sitting there last night and I was like, do I show this piece where I'm at the museum in Benin, or do I show this piece where I'm at the National Museum in Lagos? And it's just what he said, it fit better. I agree, okay? I should have showed her anyway. I should have showed them both. And I have interviewed a number of women. If you see the documentary, they're in there. And so that was a slight on my part. And thank you very much for pointing it out. I will try to correct that in future presentations.
Okay, sorry, we are really running a little bit late of time, and I suggest that we take the two questions that were already online for a time, but we are having a wrap up, and you can save your questions for the last round. Is that okay? Okay, so I now ask Manjuja to ask a question.
Hi. Yes, hi. I just wanted to say amazing presentation. And also in terms, the question I had is going forward, like decolonial practices I find are sometimes caught within institutions. I always think about this in my own practice as a intangible cultural heritage specialist. I work within performing arts spaces, events, as well as museum and heritage spaces. So I often think about how we have these kind of pockets. So we talk about decolonial practices within museums or within performing arts, but I feel like it was a overarching process from like it's a multi-institutional approach, which kind of occurred on a global scale from the global north to the global south, if you kind of, for lack of a better way of saying that. But I guess going forward, how would you kind of talk about like a multi-institutional way to decolonize? And I think you vaguely touched upon this in the start of your presentation, where you talk about like universities and museums. But yeah, that's what I just wanted to ask.
So I think I read Fanon. I don't know how many of y'all read Fanon. I really read the chapter on violence very carefully. And, you know, and part of the way people talk about decolonization is they use some citation of Fanon. But if you're going to implement Fanon's decolonization, it's going to be brick by brick that you tear these institutions down. Fanon was engaged in the African liberation movement in Algeria. So he wasn't just talking about what we're talking about here, because we're mainly talking about decolonizing the narratives. Now, we have opportunities to rebuild institutions, which hopefully we will do them a different way. But the decolonization of museums, I think what we have the possibility of doing right now is decolonizing the narrative. Now, these practices are themselves liberatory. That is, they help us get in a space where we can challenge what we want from these institutions, which is what we need to do. And now that may begin the process of institutional transformation. That may begin the process of structural transformation. But until we change those narratives, and we have not changed the narratives yet, until we change those narratives, it won't go. I told you, I did my gallery in this exhibit as a tutor. I said, listen, other curators, this is what you need to be putting up front. You can't have the Sphinx from Egypt sitting in your museum and not talk about how it got here. That is, not talk about the politics, not talk about what happened with the Ottoman Empire, what happened with Egypt, and how that could actually find itself here. I'm not saying it shouldn't be there, but I'm saying it can't be there without discussing the truth about it, because it was put there to discuss a certain kind of truth, to create a certain kind of narrative. And we need to change those narratives. How we do that is the beginning of this process of change. And I do think we need to do that in how we, whether it is a performance or whether it is an exhibit or whether it is a redesign of a museum space. We need to consider what we're talking about, how we're talking about, and we need to gain a better understanding of those 6 questions that I suggested to you. Thank you very much for your question.
Okay, now I'm taking one last question, and this is the question of Dedria Farmer-Pellman. Please, would you turn on your microphone?
Yes, thank you very much. I just want to thank the Humboldt Forum for doing this particular program, and express my appreciation to all of the ideas that have been presented. Professor Zuberi, I'm very grateful for the sensitivity you've taken with the University of Pennsylvania's exhibit. And I'm just curious to know from any of the other museum professionals in the space, as a descendant of enslaved Africans, and also recently learning that I have DNA coming from the Edo people of the Benin Kingdom, you know, some of us are in the diaspora due to the transatlantic slave trade, and most likely be in exchange for the manillas that are in the Benin bronzes. And of course, this is the reason for our organization's effort to engage museums, to actually acknowledge our connection to these relics, to change the narratives in museums, and to allow us to be co-owners, to have relics repatriated to us as well. It happens in other places. Last year in the United Kingdom, cultural relics were repatriated to other people who had been displaced from their Aboriginal lands in Australia. So we feel that we are no different. And of course, at this stage, it's reasonable to engage with Nigeria and the people of the Benin Kingdom because they are exactly where they were but we get punished because we were traded in exchange for these relics to be made. And so I ask you, what kind of efforts are you engaged in to ensure that all of us have a say in how these relics are exhibited? This is, the sister from Nigeria, and I'm sorry I missed her name, wonderful presentation. And I loved everything she had to say about how she's exhibiting or how we could exhibit. But I think it would be also helpful to hear from us so that you can hear how we feel about the relics, how we feel about the absence of our history in the narratives. These relics would not even exist. Most of them, the metal ones, would not exist but for the fact that we've been sold into the transatlantic slave trade. So I just ask you, how are you engaging all of us in decisions around the display, the repatriation of the relics? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deidre. So I have myself engaged in, this is not the first conversation that I've had with my sister. So I have engaged in this conversation with people in Nigeria, with people in Senegal, with people in South Africa, with people in Morocco, with people in a number of African nations, and with many interested folks in different parts of the world. Whether that is in London or in Paris or any of these places. And so I have myself, I can do what I do. So I do exhibits and I make documentary films. So I could ask the Humboldt Forum to give me access to try to present that as part of that conversation. And the Humboldt Forum is in its enlightened wisdom that's why I said, given me unprecedented access to its collection. I even went to the archive yesterday. And, and I will try to tell that story as I've been trying to tell the story in other places. Now, all museums is not like that. I mean, the British Museum gave me such a hard time that they finally just said no. The Louvre as well. But, they have a certain political space that they contained. I mean, they let me get all the way to the door before they told me no. And it's not an easy trip from Philly, but I made it several times. So, there is not an equal reception on all sides to us engaging in that debate. I'll say that as a member of this African diaspora that you are defining. That's why at one moment, what I suggested is, for me, the touchstone is like my granddaughter. What are you going to do about my granddaughter? My granddaughter wants to see these things. Okay, she doesn't know she wants to see them. Now she does, because I took her to see them. And she loved the exhibit because it was built in a way that could allow her to interact with it. And not only did she love them, she has a right to love them. You cannot forget about her and her rights. So what I can do is what I do best. I can write about that. I can talk about that. I can try to explain to others why I think they ought to be engaged in these processes. And, those are the kinds of things that I can do. I can engage in conversations with you and with others, as I have done. I can engage in conversations with you and people from Benin, which I have done. And so I can continue those processes of both having my own conversations and try to engage in conversations with others. But as I suggested earlier, it is clear to me that what you do need to have at the table is the African diaspora. Not having the African diaspora at the table is not a good idea. It's just continuing an old tradition where you bury the African diaspora in order to forget about the connections between colonialism and enslavement. And I'm suggesting to you all that can't be done. Scholars have done it for way too long, invented entire fields of discipline that do it. And so part of the thing that we can do is bring them back together. Now, you know, maybe people here haven't heard this perspective, and I hope we have given them some information about it, and that in their further considerations of these issues, they will also bring those to the fore. I've long been interested in having a more general, robust conversation about this by organizing a workshop at the University of Pennsylvania. Maybe I can convince some of these colleagues to come over to Penn and we continue the conversation, and you can come on also, Deidre. So those are the ways that I have myself tried to engage in this process. I want to thank you for your question, as I always thank you for your question. And I want to thank you for making sure I do not forget. And I will not forget, and I will try to keep it up front. And I thought I said something about that. Did I say something about that earlier, y'all? Y'all don't remember? My granddaughter? How you? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zuberi. I want to thank you because I think you asked some very hard-hitting questions, and I think that is one of your strengths. But you also, at the end here, provided us a very hardcore solution, or a move towards a solution, which is including the African diaspora's voice more openly than we perhaps have. So thank you very much.